Hello and welcome to the Reformed Gamers. Hey, a quick note before you get into episode 197, where I got to sit down and talk to Colin Moriarty. I'm going to be completely honest with you. I was so nervous that I was getting to talk with Colin Moriarty that I completely forgot to bring up that we normally run a family-friendly show and, to try to minimize the cussing. And if a cuss word does slip out, then we'll edit it out. But I forgot to do that, and I didn't realize that until pretty much halfway through the recording. And so with that being said, I just want to let you know that if you normally listen to the show with your kids around, this is probably one of the few episodes that you will want to put your headphones on or listen to the show at a later date when your kids aren't around. With that being said, I still think that you are going to enjoy this episode. I think you're going to enjoy the conversation that I got to have with Colin Moriarty about GameCube games, gaming journalism, game reviews, and even Catholicism and where he's at now in regards to God. If you like this episode, be sure to leave a like and also hit the subscribe button here on the channel and the bell icon so you're notified of any new content that we upload, such as podcast episodes, reactions to different things going on in the gaming world, and just my overall thoughts on the games that I'm playing in my backlog. But again, I just want to thank you for checking out this episode and enjoy. Hello and welcome, dear listeners, to the Reformed Gamers, episode 197, the show all about theology, video games, and anything else that we can really think of. I'm your host, Logan, and joining me for this episode is special guest, Colin Moriarty of Last Stand Media. Man, say hello to the listeners.
Hello, listeners. Thank you for having me. It's good to be here. I appreciate it.
Yeah, we appreciate you carving out the time to come on the show and just kind of talk about different things from gaming to religion and all that stuff. We're super excited to have you on. This is actually kind of a bucket list moment for me because I've been following you since Podcast Beyond, and so I'm really excited to have you on the show.
Cool, thank you. I appreciate the long time support.
Yeah. And hopefully my nervousness doesn't come across, but I'm trying to hide that as best I can. So if I just say anything weird, words are hard is kind of the quote of our show. So we'll just roll with that.
Yeah, you're totally fine, and I'm totally in a state of relaxation. So join me. It'll be fun. It's
okay.
Nothing to worry about.
Sounds good. So Colin, I was surprised, when I mentioned to our community that you would be coming on the show at a later date. Some folks in our community were like, that's really cool. We're super excited for you, but who is Colin Moriarty? Are we supposed to know who that is? And I was like, oh snap. I didn't know that, because I guess when you do the podcast for so long, you kind of get in this bubble of like, when you mention a game or a person, people just you just assume people know. But there's some folks that listen to our show that aren't quite as into games media or maybe even other podcasts that like what we are. So would you mind taking the moment to kind of explain kind of who you are, what you've been doing in games media, and a little bit about Last Stand Media?
Sure. It's always good to talk to new people, by the way. It's funny because gaming and just any kind of coverage on the internet has grown into such a huge amount of niches that it makes sense. Like there are massive channels I encounter in gaming where I'm like, I've never heard of these people, and they've been doing this for 9 years. And so it's always cool to be able to interface with new people. So yeah, I'm Colin. Been in the industry for about 19 years now.
Oh, wow.
In a paid capacity. And I'm 36. I own Last Stand Media, which is a podcast network and the Patreon's most popular gaming outlet, which is pretty cool. And I used to write for GameFAQs when I was in high school in the late 90s and early 2000s. That's kind of how I got my start. And then I wrote for IGN as a freelancer, and I was an intern at IGN a couple times, and I became a full-time employee there in 2007. I worked there until 2014. I co-founded Kind of Funny, and then I left Kind of Funny in 2017, and then founded Last Stand Media. And I'm widely considered, I guess, like an expert in PlayStation specifically. And my show, Sacred Symbols, a PlayStation podcast, is one of the biggest gaming podcasts, which is cool. And we focus on PlayStation, but we also I don't do it, but others in my company do an Xbox podcast called Defining Duke. And I do a nostalgia and retro podcast with my brother called Knockback as well. But our meat and potatoes is certainly PlayStation coverage. And so if you listen to Podcast Beyond back in the day or anything like that, or PS I Love You, those were my shows at one time.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's kind of, like I said, that's kind of where I started listening to you, was on Podcast Beyond. But I've really enjoyed the lineup that you have at Last Stand Media. I was even listening to Defining Duke when that came out, and I didn't have an Xbox just yet, but I played on PC. And so I've been even enjoying that show with Mr. Matty Plays, and now Lord Incognito, who I think is a really good addition to the show in light of Carrick stepping out.
I agree. We were thrilled to get him. He was kind of like our prime target when we were trying to figure out who we wanted. There were a couple of people, and he was like the prime target, and we were glad that he said yes. Although, we were ready for him to drive a hard bargain, and we have to cajole him a little bit, but he was happy to do it, and we were happy to have him, and the show has been better than ever, I think.
Yeah, definitely. I can definitely agree with that. Well, cool. Well, dear listeners, as always, if you are curious about some of those podcasts, the links to all that will be in your show notes, so you can go check those out for yourself. I mean, I would recommend them, of course, but definitely go check those out and see what you think. So before we get into the rest of the show, a little bit of housekeeping before we get into the show itself. As always, there's new content going up on the YouTube channel, so links to all that will be in your show notes as well. In case you hadn't noticed or hadn't checked the video out, I did announce that I was going to take down, or attempt to take down, my entire backlog of games by next July of 2022. And so we'll see if I can do it. There's a few videos up cataloging that progress currently as well. Colin, I can't remember how do you feel about backlogs in games and things of that nature?
They're haunting. I mean, I think everyone,
Yeah.
I think everyone kind of has one, and people that say that they don't, I think, are lying. I just think that people deal with them differently. And a while ago, I started to just shrug off. Like there was a time when I'm like, you know what? I've always meant to play Assassin's Creed. I haven't played one since 3. I'm never going to play an Assassin's Creed game. I just stopped. Like I used to play Call of Duty every year, the campaign. I'm like, I don't know that I'm going to be able to do this anymore. I think kind of for me, mentally letting go of some things has truncated the backlog, but there's always something on it. And what's peculiar is over the last couple of weeks, I've not really been in a gaming mood,
Hmm.
which happens. Like I'm like, I don't want to game. I just want to
Yeah.
sit and read, or I play with my GI Joes and clean the house and, do that. Like this morning I was like cleaning my garbage cans in the front, like, like your garbage and recycling. And I was
Yeah.
like literally just like cleaning. I don't know what the fuck I'm doing. So there are times when that happens, and even though the backlog is considerable, I don't want to jump into it. So I kind of try to forgive myself. I also feel like trophy hunting, which is a huge part of my gaming, is makes it very difficult to have a backlog that is conceivable to get through if you're trying to 100% everything. So backlog game, I mean, I'll tell you, man, there are times where I go back on my backlog and I'm like, wow, that was awesome. I'm about to play Metro Exodus, and that's one that's been in my backlog for a long time. So it's worth going back. And this has been such a nice time because nothing's coming out. So
Yeah, for sure. That's kind of what I was thinking. Because I mean, you talk about, it's kind of nice to go back and see some of those games. Death Stranding was the one that I started the whole thing off with, and I was like, man, this game is. I mean, I had heard people say it's like a walking simulator, boring, nothing to do, and then I played it and was like, no, this game's pretty awesome. Like,
it's an awesome game. I'm glad you liked it.
So I'm super super excited for the director's cut coming out September, I think. So excited to get into that. And the Metro Exodus is one that's on my calendar as well.
Yeah, I'm trying to look. I'm on your YouTube channel now, and I'm looking at it. I'm trying to see what the there's it says I'm getting rid of my backlog.
Mm-hmm.
I'm trying to see what's in the thumbnail, but I can't.
Oh yeah, some of those games.
Are there GameCube games in there?
Yeah, there's some GameCube games in there. I started collecting GameCube games a year or two ago.
Cool.
And so,
which ones are on your backlog?
Right now, I've got Baten Kaitos and Baten Kaitos Origins on there because I never played them. I'd always wanted to play them, but I just, never had an opportunity to play them.
Right.
And then, the Legend of Zelda Collector's Edition was one that I just picked up that has like Majora's Mask, Ocarina of Time.
The one you got from Nintendo Power, right? That was the one that came from Nintendo Power.
Is that where it came from?
I think so, because I have a funny story because I had 2 of them, and it was because I subscribed. I was a freshman in college, and I subscribed to Nintendo Power. I think that's how I got them. And it was like Zelda 1, Zelda 2, Majora's Mask, and Ocarina of Time, right? Yeah, this is the collection for sure. And it never came, and so I got in touch with them, and I'm like, listen, like, no offense, but I subscribed to this magazine only to get the game. So they sent me another version of the game, and then the one they sent me, I guess, fell out of a crack somewhere, and so I got 2 of them, which wasn't intentional. but
Right.
I have vivid memories of playing it because I was so excited to
Yeah.
have all of these games on the GameCube because I was a huge GameCube fan myself.
Yeah. I was the same way. I loved the GameCube, and all my friends were on Xbox or PlayStation and talking about Halo and Tekken and all that stuff. I was like, I love Animal Crossing. Y'all want to talk about that? And it just they were not
Also,
interested.
also the superior version of Soul Calibur, if they were into all
Yeah,
that kind of stuff.
yeah, because we had a link, and it was actually it was pretty cool.
Yeah, it was dope.
Pretty cool. But yeah, so trying to get through some of those, and then of course with Game Pass, and they just keep adding games. I'm honestly look at that video, and I'm like, why did I even start this? Like, there's no way I'm going to get through this backlog in a year.
That's why I'm glad not to be a member of. I mean, the subscription services are cool, but
Right.
I have no problem with them. I think that's probably the wave of the future, but I don't feel like I'm missing anything by not being there because that would just make it overwhelming for me to deal with. So not even having those options, like with the PlayStation Plus collection, like those 20 games, it's like I've played and beaten most of these
Yeah.
games. So it's like that didn't even add anything to my list really. So I couldn't imagine having something like I'm not a member of PS Now, but having access to that, like they just added a few things like Nier Automata and a few other games.
Yeah.
It's almost nice to not have that problem. It's like that's like a very first world problem in
Right.
some way.
Yeah, it is for sure. Well, speaking of games and stuff, man, let's just talk about, I mean, what's a game or a couple games that you've been really enjoying recently?
Well, I just beat and platinumed Trigger Witch from
Oh,
Reverie.
nice.
I'm sorry, not from Reverie, from Rainbite, the guys that made Reverie. Um, and my friend John O'Peck wrote it, and it was great. A twin stick shooter. I kind of tried to baby it a little bit because I wanted to. It was like the only game speaking to me for a little while, and I was like, I'm gonna be done with this in 8 or 10 hours, I know, and so it took me a little while to get through it, but I finally platinumed it a couple of days ago, and it was really enjoyable. It takes a really radical left turn in the story, which I think is awesome, and it's one of those stories where you'll never guess. Like, there's no way you'll guess where the story goes.
Oh,
And I
really?
like that kind of stuff, whether for better or for worse. So I thought that was kind of neat, and it was a really fun and charming game, well written, and a nice palate cleanser for the things to come. Because I'm excited for Tales of Arise and Deathloop and all these games that are finally going to come in September. But for now, yeah. So the other game I downloaded on the suggestion of a few people in the audience plus Dustin, that game Ender Lilies,
Oh,
Quietus of the
yeah.
Nights. It's really good. I'm only about an hour in. It's a Metroidvania 2.5D, but it's built in like Unreal, I think, and it looks pretty nice. It's not cheap looking. I always think
Hmm.
about Mighty Number 9 and games like that where it's like, oh
Yeah.
man, this looks horrible. So you can do 2.5D and make it still look flat and interesting. So it's fun, and it reminds me. I was saying on Sacred Symbols, there's a Castlevania game on, I think it was Game Boy Advance, but it could have been one of the DS ones. They're all the same, where instead of fighting with a weapon, you fought with like enemy skills. And I can't remember which one it was, but you didn't have like any weapons. You like equipped a skill that
Yeah.
you got from an enemy, and there was like a series of cards you would equip. And and this is kind of like that. You're a little girl, you're defenseless, and you have like these knights or these like spirits that fight for you. So when you hit X, the knight comes out and swings for you, or when you hit triangle, like a knight comes
Okay.
out and like uses a mace and gets in front of you and defends you and stuff. It's pretty cool. So I'm looking forward to getting
Okay.
into that a little bit more. I just beat Scarlet Nexus a couple weeks ago. I wanted to get the platinum trophy in it, but I just don't want to play it again. It's just too
Did you not like
anime
it?
for me. It was really fun. It's really great. It's a great game, but it's just so anime. I mean, by the end, I actually skipped parts of the ending,
Oh,
which
wow.
because it's like I'm like, this is so long. I don't care. I don't even know what's going on. But the gameplay is so fun, and I've rarely encountered a game that more cleverly dealt with a party system in an active battle environment. It's very cool if people want to check it out. Um, but yeah, I was gonna play that again. Talking about backlogs, I was like, I can't bring myself to do it. So yeah, no, I'm just kind of in a wait and see. And I'm also playing Perils of Baking, which is Mike Studio Lilymo's very first game.
Oh,
Just
okay.
because we're releasing a massive update for it, and so I'm trying to just gather a bunch of notes because we released a massive update for our newest game, Hebroxia 2, for free. Like a new stage, a new boss, a bunch of new like journal entries and writing and enemies,
Oh, okay.
new game plus and all of that, trophies. And so we've decided to do that for every one of our games. So we're going to go back to the beginning now, and we are like totally rehauling Perils of Baking, although we'll more officially announce it in the coming weeks, and that's actually delayed our next game, which we're internally calling Forest Guardian, although I call it Barry Bobble.
Why do you call it Berry Bobble?
Because it's like Bubble Bobble. It's like Bubble Bobble is a major inspiration for it, and Barry is like really passionate about it, so I call it Barry Bobble. We don't know what we're gonna call it in finality yet, but that will come out next year. And we're also working on a role-playing game, so which is pushed further out. But we feel like we want to massage. It's for these very reasons when people positively talk about games they're playing, right? Like now we're in a situation with PS4 and with Xbox One, the last generation, where the games as they exist will probably exist in perpetuity through all of the consoles. Like everything's going to be able to pull back at least from that point. So we want to make sure in 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, people go back and find the very best version of Perils of Baking, the very best version of Twin Breaker, etc. So maybe if they encounter it in a podcast that doesn't exist yet, and they're like, oh, I found this old brick breaker called Twin Breaker, and it's really great. They don't find this broken or like forgotten about game. Not that it was ever broken, but you understand.
Right.
So that's kind of, so I'm in a little bit of all worlds, I guess, like where my head is not just in playing right now, but in worrying about the design of the new game.
For sure. Yeah. So is Perils of Baking, is that currently released on digital storefronts, or is that one that is yet to be released?
It's on PS4, Vita, Switch, and PC, I think. It's not on Xbox yet. We're going to bring it to Xbox. So, I mean, I'll give you, we're talking about this internally because we don't know. We want Perils of Baking to be on Game Pass. We want it so Xbox has these interesting rules where if your game didn't come out day and date on their consoles, you have to add something extra to your game. It's like a stage, a mode, or whatever. And we released on PlayStation first. So they're going to be very pleased because they're getting like a brand new game. But that game's going to be on everything else. And the coolest thing is that if you already own it on PS4 or Vita or PC or Switch, you'll get the update for free.
Oh, cool.
So you'll be able to get and with Habroxia 2, we're porting our newest game to PS5 and Xbox Series X and S. We're actually redoing the trophy list for the PS5 version, and it'll be like the extremely hard version of the game.
Awesome.
Our platinum trophy is attainable probably by a third of people that play the game. We want this one to be attainable by maybe 1% or fewer of the people that play the game.
Wow.
And the beauty is that you'll have an option. It won't ruin the game for you because you can just play the PS4 version and get those trophies. But if you want the really difficult version of the trophy list, then we're going to. So, yeah, a lot going on right now that's precluding me from playing too much.
Man, sounds intense. So with the PS5 trophy list, is that going to be, because I've heard you guys talk about on Sacred Symbols a few times about how you get the PS5 version of a game and then it starts popping the trophies and you get the platinum again. Is that like circumventing that to where, or is it still going to do something like that? I guess how does that work? Do you know?
We do know it works because the saves are being read across games. So so if you're playing Final Fantasy VII, it's reading that save and then it's like, oh, you've earned these, ding ding, like because the trophy system is constantly working in the background. It's like always running checks. And that's why when a game sometimes has broken trophies, you randomly like get a trophy later and you're like, I don't know. And it's because it's randomly running these checks. And then it's like, oh, you actually need this trophy in the list. So that's easy enough to circumvent by simply not letting the games read each other's saves. And we're not going to do that. The problem we're running into with Xbox, though, is we don't know if we can do that idea on Xbox because of the smart delivery system. Everything is unified together, and we don't know if we can actually break the achievement list that way. Yeah. So it might be a PlayStation exclusive version, like this, like very hard version, which I'm excited about. I think it's fun because I was like, why? So in other words, like you get a bronze trophy in Habroxia 2 for beating every boss. I'm like, all right, so what if instead of we just rewrite those trophies so that, and we call them like name Sigma. So the trophy name Sigma. And we simply say, beat that stage without getting hit. Beat that stage without getting hit. Beat that stage without getting hit. Beat that stage, and so on and so forth. So just slightly tweak each of them. We think we'll be able to do that. Yeah. It'll be fun.
Well, very cool. I'm looking forward to the challenge. At the same time, I'm sure there will be a point where I want to break the controller and attempting it.
That's the whole thing, is like, I wouldn't do this if you didn't get it technically for free. Because even if you're buying it on PS5 for the first time, you can download the PS4 packet and play the old version. You know what I mean? So I don't feel bad about it because it's like no complaining, no bitching, no whining. You have the other version. This is for this is for the players. No, I don't know. I don't think I know Barry will be able to do it, but I don't know if I'll even be able to get the platinum. We have someone
Oh
has to
wow.
for us to pass certification, but I don't know if it'll be me.
Well, that's interesting. You're going to create a challenge that you might not even be able to complete.
We'll
But
see. Yeah, I mean, it's cool. The game is so modular where you can make your ship so powerful that
yeah, that was one of my
I am
favorite things about it.
yeah, like you can wipe the game out. I mean, the game becomes trivial actually. So
Hmm.
I feel like people will figure that out and then we'll use that to their advantage.
Yeah. Yeah. I definitely, that was one of the things I enjoyed about it because I remember when I was playing it for, I don't know, probably the first couple hours or so. And I was like, man, I'm just getting my teeth, not necessarily my teeth kicked in. That's probably too extreme, but I was definitely having some genuine difficulty there. Nothing bad or anything. But then I noticed as I was upgrading things, I'm like, oh, okay, this is getting easier. And then I got to a point where I'm like, oh, okay, well now this is just kind of not really anything to worry about.
Right, exactly. Like you earn credits and upgrading the ship is up to you. I mean, if the game's too hard, then keep upgrading your ship. If the game becomes too easy, sell the upgrades back. I think we could have communicated that better, but that was the idea. Was to make a game that was because people are intimidated by those kinds of games. It's an arcade shooter. Some people call them a shmup, but we didn't make a shmup. Trust me, that's not a shmup. Way easier than bullet hell games and stuff like that. So we needed to figure out a way to communicate that, I think, a little bit better, that maybe you shouldn't be so intimidated by the game, because if you just grind it out like a role-playing game, if you just grind enough, you'll be able to beat the shit out of the enemy in your way, and that's not going to be a huge problem. So
Yeah. And that was kind of the nice thing about it too, was that, depending on what level you were doing, you would have a different route you could take. So it's not like you were just playing the same level again, so to speak. There was an alternate route you could take. And so kind of made grinding a little more meaningful in that regard. At least that's what I thought when I was playing it.
yeah, thank you. And the update adds a new one of those optional paths with a new boss and stuff.
Oh, awesome.
So we're happy that people dug it, and yeah, we're glad that we're excited to bring it to the new generation of consoles. We just have to be a little more patient, I guess. We have, I mean, I'm looking at my PS5 dev kit; it's right to my left, but we just have to massage everything just so.
Right. Yeah. So what is it? And I guess this is kind of getting into the topic part a little bit, but since we're kind of on the topic already, I'll just ask, what has it been like? Because I mean, you've been reviewing games for what you said almost 20 years now.
Yeah, I started as a technical writer, so a guide writer, but I started reviewing
Okay.
games for IGN in well, I reviewed some in the mid aughts when I was an intern, but 2007 is really when like that career kind of began.
Okay. Gotcha. So I guess what has it been like? I guess kind of being on the other side of that conversation where you're developing games and working on games and testing the games. How is how has your time as a reviewer and someone in this field helped you out with developing games? Or has there been any, I'll save that next question for later, but what has that been like?
Yeah, I mean, it's been incredibly useful. I feel like I don't know what it is. It's not like modesty or whatever. I just think that like when you play games or you're in, like, it doesn't even have to be games, when you're into anything and you kind of just absorb it and acknowledge that it's part of your life and you understand it to a deeper level than most people, you realize that in and of itself is a piece of that's a commodity, a valuable commodity. And I started realizing that when I was at IGN, because developers would ask me questions about their games. You realize that when you would see games early, they would be like, what would you change? What do you think about this? Like, they want to pick your brain, and they realize they have a captive audience of people that really, in the case of critics, that should know their games. And when my name started popping up in credits because I was giving like good advice, I was like, oh, this is kind of interesting. Guacamelee is a great example. I'm close with those guys at Drinkbox, but the reason Guacamelee controls on the D-pad and not the analog sticks is me. And they put me in the credits for that because they were like, that was such an important part of the game being great. And because
Hmm.
when I played it the first time, I'm like, you got to get the game off the sticks. Like, this is not how people play 2D games.
Yeah.
And they did. So I realized that even though I've been having fun all these years and playing and traveling and doing all these things, that I've been learning, I've been absorbing. And I think I understand games. I fundamentally understand them because there's a subjective understanding and an objective understanding. And I think subjectivity is in taste, but objectivity is in functionality and speed and usability and all of those kinds of things. So I think that's what I've been able to bring to bear to Lilymo, and what's been useful to us is me looking at a game and being like, this has got to change. Like, we can't have this. This doesn't make sense. This doesn't read right, et cetera, and so on. And you realize that, like, that's something that you earn over time, that you can't learn. It's just probably like a person who makes films watching an indie film and being like, oh, I see this is wrong. This wasn't filmed in the right light or whatever. And maybe you don't say anything, and maybe it doesn't even affect the enjoyability of the product overall, but you notice it. And so I think being critical has, again, brought that to bear, but it's also made me, I think, kinder to other games, not in my critique of them per se, but just not being so flippant, because I understand full well now how hard it is to make a game. And we're making 2D arcade games. We're not making anything that is overwhelmingly difficult to make. It just takes time and it takes skill. And most of the skills with Barry, who's our programmer and designer, and most of the skills with our artists and that we freelance with and stuff like that, I have very little to do with anything. I write something in like a day, and that's my, and then I produce the game. But it's been interesting, like, to see how the sausage is made, and then it does make you think twice about bringing the hammer down on someone so thoughtlessly. It doesn't change the opinion on something being bad or good, but it does maybe stop you from saying this is garbage, or like the
Right.
whatever toxic nomenclature we choose to use. I've been more mindful of that. So I think that's kind of the other side of the situation for me.
That's been one thing that's always been frustrating for me is, granted, I was a youth pastor for 5 years. So, I mean, when junior high kids say a game is trash, they're usually just like, it's what it is. But then kind of when I talk with other people that are more around my age, in the 30s or so, and they're like, man, this game's trash. I'm like, well, is it though? Like, is it really, like, I don't know. It's like, I can't remember what game it was recently, but someone had said something like, actually, I think it might've been Death Stranding. Someone had referred to it as trash or something and boring. I was like, there's got to be more to it, because I know Kojima doesn't really, like, he doesn't make junk. You may not like the game that he made, but it's not.
It's definitely not trash.
Yeah, and so
I agree with you. I've been one of those people. I mean, I've always used flippant language. We all have. When you speak for thousands of hours into a microphone, you're going to say like, "Oh, this is bad. I hated this." Or,
right.
But when you start reading that about your own games, and I remember, like, there are things I've read about our games where I'm like, "That's bullshit." Like,
Yeah,
like, to myself, I'm like, "That's." And I remember reading a review and even like being like, this guy doesn't understand this game at all. I'm not trying to be a dick. It's just like, you've missed all of this context, but you can't say anything about it. All you have to do is be better in the future about your own criticism. What I've been trying to say recently on our show is, I want people to just know where I'm coming from. If you disagree with what I'm saying about anything, that's totally fine. It doesn't have to be criticism. It could be politics or any philosophy or life, whatever. I at least want you to know how I broke it down mentally. And if I'm using the word, so like when I read like, oh, Harbroxia 2 is trash, I'm like, I don't think it is. And that's the objective part of my mind. And but then I'm like, oh, I've flippantly on games in the past too with no regard.
Yeah.
And now I know better. So
yeah. Well, it's also just like, I guess one of the things that's always frustrated me with that kind of phrasing is, it's just like, what are you even supposed to do with it? Like, the game's trash. It's like, okay, cool. What do you want me to do about it?
Right. And that's why reducing games to scores was always so silly to me. I was always more into the critical nature of the review. I got sad at IGN that reviews got shorter and shorter and shorter while I was there. People might remember the mid-aughts, the early aughts, the late 90s. You could have like a 10,000 word review on IGN. Like I remember the Grand Theft Auto, I think it was San Andreas review, was like 8 pages, like paginated pages.
Oh, wow.
And we scored it at the end, and we were realizing as we went on, everyone's reading like the first page and then just going to the last page. But there was people that did like the criticism in between, and I always like that too. That's why I like doing our spoiler cast and our review discussions, because it allows us to just lay to bear everything that we feel about a game and what we think is most important about a game to discuss, good or bad.
Yeah. And that's something that I appreciate about y'all spoiler reviews, that you go in depth. And even with someone like Carrick at ACG, and we don't do a whole lot of reviews, for our website, but when we do, I've kind of made it a point to be like, let's let's kind of get away from scores, because like, yes, I want people to come to the website, but I want people to read and understand, if we didn't like something about the game, why we didn't necessarily like it, so they understand, like, okay, they didn't like it for this reason, but I am okay with this kind of mechanic, so I'm going to be okay with it. And so they have that kind of context, because I just feel like boiling things down into a number is very, and I don't know if this is the right word, reductionist. It's just I just don't feel like it really helps, but that's just kind of my opinion on that.
Well, I was very anti-score at IGN, vehemently, loudly at meetings and at retreats, and like for years, just like we got to
You
get rid
bring
of
it up at
scores, like we
retreats
got to
too.
get rid of scores. And I understood the argument against it, which was, dude, like if we got rid of scores, it's going to hurt the bottom line. It's going to hurt traffic. We're
Sure.
not going to be
Yeah.
as important. We're going to be off of Metacritic and all these other things where,
Oh yeah.
Metacritic, a lot of people don't realize Metacritic is not an average. I think a lot of people think that it is. It's not like 50 reviews divided, and then their score is averaged out over the 50 of them. It's like some have huge weights and some don't. And IGN's weight on Metacritic is higher than any game critic.
Huh.
So an IGN review counts like 4 times,
Oh
compared to
wow.
like a review that will count once in the Metacritic score. So it's not just like,
Okay.
if IGN gave a game an 8 and another score was a 7, and they merged those together and said like, oh, a 75, that's not what it would be. It would be like more like a 78, you know?
Okay. Huh.
And Metacritic keeps that score. That's like proprietary, and they keep that secret. So there's
Okay.
all of these things that, admittedly, with Per Schneider and others that are in situations of the C-suite and all of that, where they have to worry about money and all of that, which I'm in now with my companies, I was like, yeah, I understand that, but I just feel like we're reducing it so much that it's now like a few paragraphs and a score. And I
Yeah.
go back and look at my reviews. I reviewed hundreds of games. I go back and look at my scores. I'm like, I don't know what the fuck I was thinking about this. And then I read the review and I'm like, oh, I kind of agree with the review, but I don't know how I got a 7.8 out of this, or and like I look at PlayStation All Stars and I'm like, I gave that game an 8. That's fucking insane. And then I look at games like Last of Us. And I'm like, yeah, I'd still give it a 10 or whatever.
Hmm.
But I always hated that, especially because 5 is not the average. The
Hmm.
average is more like 7. So
Right. Yeah.
I
So I
digress.
guess with that, how did y'all come up with the number exactly? Because I've always, when I go to IGN and see the reviews, it's like a 7.6 or even like a 7.9 or whatever it may be, and I'm always like, man, how do you? I guess how do you narrow down the point, whatever number it is, on a number?
You don't really. I mean, so IGN used to have a 100-point scale. Then we had a 10-point scale, and then a 20-point scale, and
Oh
then back to a
wow.
100-point scale, all while I was
Okay.
there. And when the 100-point scale existed, I tried to force myself to use it, but you would find that if you go and look at my reviews, you'll find that most of them are 0.0 or 0.5, and most of them are just 0.0, like 8,
Hmm.
7, 6, 9. Because I couldn't explain the answer to that. And I used to be really open about that when I was even on Podcast Beyond. I'm like, I don't know the difference between a 9.7 and a 9.6. And I think the idea was that you would be able to, and I remember arguing about this in meetings too, because it just didn't make sense. But the idea was you'd be able to then put all of our reviews in order and see a very granular list of
Oh, okay.
all of the games, right? And I was like, but that is only useful if it's for one critic, because the
Hmm.
the extra trifling of point whatever is where we're getting lost in the weeds, and where people are definitely going to disagree. Like, I'm sure there are a lot of people at IGN that didn't agree with 10 for Last of Us, but would have given it a
Hmm.
9.5, right?
Right.
And that quibbling in the middle is a huge difference when you're granularly placing them in a list, which was the idea. So getting rid of that stuff was acknowledging that we had no idea, and then bringing it back was just, I don't know. And that was a long time ago. I have no idea what's going on there now. I haven't been there
Sure.
in
Yeah.
so long. It's almost, I didn't work there starting in the beginning of 2015, so it's actually been forever.
Man. So with that, I guess, to kind of talk about this one thing, and then we can move on to something else, or we'll see where it goes. But when it comes to like giving a game a 10, like, and I'm sure you can only really speak for yourself, but when you give a game a 10, like, does that mean the game is perfect, or does it still have some issues? Or I guess kind of what kind of goes into giving your game a 10, or
Yeah,
a
I
game a
only gave
10?
one game a 10, which was The Last of Us,
Mm-hmm.
and so giving a 10 would usually require a meeting, and because they give them away a little bit more crazily now, but I think my 10 was like only the 11th that we ever gave or something like that.
Oh
These are
wow.
games
Okay.
like Undead Nightmare, I think got a 10, which I think was a little weird, but we're talking about games like an Uncharted game or something, a Mario game, something in that echelon. And no, but at IGN, 10 was not perfect. There was no such thing as a perfect game. We looked at it in our rubric as a masterpiece, like a defining game, usually what we would consider a generation defining game. So
Hmm.
when you think about, in my opinion, like Mario Galaxy, that's that's a 10. When you think about Super Mario
Sure.
World, that's a 10. Castlevania Symphony of the Night, that's a 10.
Yep.
And the original Last of Us, I think, is a 10. I actually think the Last of Us Part 2 is in many ways better, but I don't know if it's a 10 because I don't think it was as generation defining as the first one. And I think in some way the
Hmm.
zeitgeist matters, not in how you interpret it later, but especially what it meant at that time. I mean, I personally think Mario 64 I think that game is vastly overrated. I think Super Mario Sunshine is a better game.
Oh man.
Mm,
Okay,
But
we agree on that then.
and I know that's becoming more popular, but that was a very unpopular. There's a lot of GameCube revisionism now. That's another topic, but because everyone hated Wind Waker, everyone hated Sunshine, and now
Yeah.
everyone like loves them. I'm like, okay,
No.
no, you
Yeah.
didn't. You definitely didn't. But you look back at these games and you're like, but could you deny Mario 64's import, the the heft it brought, and the way it played for its time and how ahead of its time it was? And I'm like, yeah, that's a relevant thing. It's almost like scores are. If you're going to score a game, it should almost be something that is flexible and moves. Because I feel in some way like you can go back and look at 1985 Super Mario Brothers and be like, how can this game not be a 10? I mean, I don't understand how this game
Yeah.
can't be a 10. But if you were comparing it perhaps to other games of its time, not on NES, but maybe on PC and Mac, you'd be like, well, this game's a little lo-fi. So would it get a different score from that perspective? I don't know. And this is exactly why scores are dumb and why there's a million different ways to skin a cat. So like the it's in the review itself what you think is important. Because we used to have a thing where I remember dealing with freelancers where it's like, well, the freelancer would be like, well, I didn't talk about the sound of the game and I didn't talk about the music and I didn't talk about this moment and stuff. And I'm like, but your review is not
Mhm.
supposed to be a full strip down of everything in the game. It's supposed to be about what is important and relevant to the thesis of the review. And if people want something else, then they go somewhere else.
Yeah. Man. That's all good to know. That's a lot of stuff I never even knew, but that was a good behind the scenes kind of look at reviews and kind of how they work. But with something you had mentioned in the middle of that, IGN's kind of giving out more tens. I don't want to say flippantly, but they may be giving out more. And there's definitely been some changes within gaming journalism. And I guess for you as someone who is still in the industry, kind of from when you started to where you're at now, how has the landscape kind of changed in regards to what's being written? Because I remember a few podcast episodes you did. I think one was with Ryan McCaffrey about gaming journalism and how some outlets are producing stuff that I guess is kind of confusing as to why that's being written in the way that it's written. Like, I don't know, like I remember God of War back in 2018 being a big one about like toxic masculinity or something. And I'm like, I'm playing God of War. I don't like, how does that fit in there?
Can
And
you
so
imagine the God of War being toxically masculine? It's almost unbelievable.
I know it just,
It should be a transgender, woman. It should be the God of War. I mean, that's the whole thing. Is like, well, I mean, it doesn't make any sense. Well, wouldn't you
yeah,
want the God of War to be just like you'd want the God of Love to maybe be like feminine and kind and sweet?
right.
You would expect the God of War to
Nurturing.
probably be pretty brutal, I would assume.
Yeah. And so I guess what has it been like for you to kind of see this? I mean, have you noticed a change? Is there a change
Oh
or
yeah,
kind of,
there's a huge change. First of all, there's no one like me in games media anymore in that side of games media, and it sucks because I've said it from you can tell that the inmates run the asylum at a lot of these places, because if I were the editor in chief or the managing editor at one of these websites, I'd be like, man, we need conservative voices. We need religious voices, I'm not religious, but like religious voices, or we need all these other things that I've been defamed for even saying. But I'm like, these things, if we're going to write about games and entertainment from a political or social, philosophical point of view, which is fine, I think that's awesome, then certainly you want to represent more points of view. And I'm not saying this to brag, but just to make the point, to put a point on it. If I were at Kotaku, I would be the biggest writer at Kotaku. If I were at IGN, I would be the biggest writer at IGN. And I look at that and I'm like, what are you guys doing? You don't necessarily want to go after me. I have my own thing. I'm not. That's not going to happen. But there are others like me that say something just a little bit different. And from a survival standpoint, you would think you'd want that. And there would be people with longer memories. Certainly Ryan, Damon, and others at IGN that remember how much we thrived when we had all of these conflicting opinions being published constantly. And now things happen and you can just predict what's going to be said. That's why with the Activision Blizzard thing, which is a horrible situation, instead of just adding on to like the condemnation, that's obvious. I don't need to virtue signal that at all. Instead, I was like, well, we know how everyone else is going to cover this. So I'm going to go get my lawyer friend, Reco from Virtual Legality, and we did 2 episodes already from a legal standpoint. Because it's like, what can we contribute to this from a more material and useful standpoint that differentiates our content from others' content? And I think that that's the way we do it, because there has been and is a sea change going on, and they're eating themselves. They're destroying their own websites. That's the saddest part. And when I have it out sometimes with these guys, especially from Kotaku, I ask them, I'm like, well, how does it feel? And how could you just destroy something like that? If you gave me that, I wouldn't want Kotaku, but if you gave me that, I would make it better. And you're fucking it up. And that wasn't the way it was. More and more people play games every day. Fewer and fewer people read Kotaku. More and more people play on PlayStation every day. Fewer and fewer people read GameSpot and IGN. More and more people are on Game Pass. Fewer and fewer people read Polygon and The Verge. That's a you problem, right?
Yeah.
Because you have more and more potential customers every day that are only finding you because you scrape SEO and you write clickbait headlines and all this kind of stuff. And that's why I give out a shout out all the time to the websites I think are doing really good work. Like Push Square is a great PlayStation website that I highly endorse.
I like them.
Video Games Chronicle, VGC, is a great website. I've actually been having some behind the scenes correspondence with them because they thanked us for shouting them out recently. Okay. And that's run by Andy Robinson, who's a British guy, a very OG guy in the games industry. And they break stories, they write about things. But see, it's not that I mind the political coverage. It's just that I mind the one-sided political coverage because I'm more curious than that. And I mind the demonization of people because I'm in the group that you're demonizing, and in a lot of different ways. And I think the reason that our content shines is because we have kind of a welcoming attitude towards all. And it's not that we shy away from difficult conversations. We talk about, in fact, we're like the only ones talking about some of this shit, like what's going on with China and Tencent.
I was just about to bring that up. I actually, because I didn't know a whole lot about that until you brought it up on sacred symbols, and then I learned more about it from there. I'm like, oh man, I'm really glad I learned about this. And then I noticed that I think you were the only podcast I had in my queue that really talked about it.
It's sad because I want more people to talk about these things, and people are like, actually, it's funny because Tom from Moore's Law is Dead, who I did a Sacred Symbols Plus episode with that will go live soon, the tech expert and all of that, he put it really well where he's like, sorry, like we're adults and like adult situations happen even in the hobbies and escapes that we look to free us from the doldrums of the real world. It doesn't mean that you're immune to it. And we saw, I mean, I don't know if you saw, but Tencent is so wrapped up in the Chinese Communist government that they had said the media, which is all run by the government, called gaming like a new opium or something like that, and Tencent stock fell like 15%. And it's no wonder they want Western entities that are not going to be under the thumb of this specific stuff, but you worry about it going in reverse, and that no one is talking about it. I mean, look at the capitulation of the NBA. Look at the capitulation of John Cena. Look at the danger that Taiwan is in manufacturing. Silicon and chip manufacturing is there. There's a lot that's political, but you don't hear about that because they're too busy writing about stuff that you can write about, but who cares? Like the newest non-binary character in fucking
like
Life is Strange or whatever. And it's like, that's fine. But if you want to cover games politically, then what about the political stuff that's happening in games? You can't, well, you can, but you shouldn't pick and choose like that. And I don't pick and choose. So when something like that comes up on the show, we do try to frame it to say like, listen, we're going to talk about a political issue now. Fast forward.
Right.
That's the best we can do. We're not going to just dodge those topics.
Yeah. And that's been the thing that I've kind of was just noticing that, noticing how I hesitate to call it a bit of an echo chamber with some of these outlets, but just the one perspective view on how they take some of these things or how they don't even talk about some of these things. It kind of has me wondering. And one of our patrons who wrote in, Chris Freeman, he even asked, like, is it even possible for a conservative voice to make it in games journalism today, or should they just kind of try to carve their own path online on like YouTube or a
Yeah,
website?
there's no chance. No. So, I mean, obviously, there's no chance. I'll be shocked if Eurogamer or like one of the great websites, like I don't want to say great, but one of the more respected websites, like Eurogamer or Edge or what, like these random websites that have like a high caliber of writer, if they're not going to start the trends, then you're never going to see it bubble down to the sites that are garbage, basically. So you have to carve your own path. And the beauty of today's internet is also what's scary about it, which is that anyone can do whatever they want.
Yeah.
So when I started writing for GameFAQs in the late 90s, that was kind of like a thing that you had to put yourself out there. You were an email address and like a name, and that's all you had. And it was a little more difficult to get noticed, and you just grinded and did the best you could and created community that way. And so the barrier to entry was much higher and harder, but it was easier to get noticed. Today, the
Mhm.
barrier to entry is in the ground, and so it's going to be easier to be noticed, but harder for the cream to rise to the top, or for you to be part of the cream that rises to the top.
Right.
So it's a little bit of give and take, but I really feel like when you look at the environment, with rare exception, but when you look at the media environment, the people that do well in the independent realm when it comes from a political, philosophical, or social point of view are usually moderates or conservatives, because everyone says the same exact thing on the other side. I mean, there's guys like Jim Sterling and stuff that stick out, but really, like, you don't need Jim Sterling, no offense to him, because you can just read IGN and get the same regurgitative stuff that you're going to get there, or on Kotaku and Polygon and all these other places. It's, I think, a little easier to stand out when you have something a little different to say. And so I would just forge your own path, whether it's on, and I'd pick your vertical too, whether it's on YouTube, Twitch, or podcast services, and just be consistent with it. I always say I
Mhm.
started out with massive advantages in this space over and over again, but I did at one point earn those advantages. And so you have to earn the advantages that will get you noticed. But I think that if you put in the work and consistency, you can't rely on anyone else to come look for you and listen to your content if they can't find you.
Yeah.
So it's important to be consistent and put it out on the line, but also be realistic that it's a dice roll. You can't know what's going to happen, and the only thing you can do is kind of work towards weighting the dice a little bit. But still, you have to throw
Yeah.
it, and you don't know how it's going
Yeah.
to come up.
That's something that I've kind of learned even with doing this show. I mean, we've been doing this for over 6.5 years now, and it's one of those things, like, if you never really even roll the dice to begin with, like, nothing happens, and then you just kind of have to adjust and make changes to get feedback and move on from there. And I think we've been pretty successful in what we've been able to do. I know when I started out the show, my idea was like, okay, I want to talk about worldviews of video games, but from a Christian perspective, because I didn't see anyone else doing that at the time. And I was like, man, if I'm asking these questions about games, like, is it a sin to download ROMs, or is it a sin to play Grand Theft Auto or whatever it may be? Surely there's other people that are curious about that too, and I think we've carved out a pretty good niche. It's definitely a niche, a small niche, but I think it's definitely worth just kind of. I mean, plus at the end of the day, if it doesn't work out, you at least learn some new skills, and
Yeah,
you can use those.
definitely.
But
I've been really lucky again, but a lot of hard work and consistency come from it as well. So
yeah,
use the tools at your disposal and do something different.
yeah, for sure. So with that being said, and we're kind of keeping an eye on the time here. I guess with me bringing up the kind of the purpose of the show, kind of like what we do, our perspective, our niche, so to speak. Something I kind of wanted to ask you, because I used to listen to Fireside Chats pretty religiously, and pun intended on that one. Really enjoyed a lot of the conversations that you had. I even got my wife to listen to it. I think you had a teacher on at one point, and she loved that episode. She's a junior high English teacher, and there was a series of episodes you did where you're talking about kind of like God and Christianity and things like that. And I remember Pater from Christian Geek Central is a friend of the show. He was on there, and I guess kind of what I wanted to know, because the conversations you had were not surface level. They got deep, and you asked some hard questions. And it's been a while removed from those. I kind of, what is your outlook on, or I guess how has your outlook on God shifted since then, if at all?
Yeah, I think it shifted a little bit. Yeah, Pater's a really nice guy. I owe
Yeah.
him an email, actually. He emails me once in a while. I try to get back to him quickly, but this one fell down. So that actually reminds me I should probably email him this week. But I feel like my mind is always in flex. And when I look around at the world, I sometimes wonder if I'm the only one. People seem like very dug in. And you only see people in like these flashes, right? Like these moments. You don't necessarily follow them like or biographically rather through their lives to see how they adjusted, but you just feel like there's a sharpness and a dug in disposition on everything. And I've never been that way. And as it gets to become more that way in society, I still remain the same in my own mind. And I just say that because I feel like in some ways I become more liberal politically, no doubt actually about that. Like more of a populist, really, over the last few years since I've kind of like gone silent since Fireside Chats ended a few years ago,
Hmm.
and just again gone just read and think and listen to podcasts and debates and videos. And with religion, I think I've become, I went through these cycles of being like, for your audience wouldn't know, but I grew up Catholic and went to Catholic school for a while and all that kind of stuff. My
Hmm.
family's devoutly Catholic still, and I was obviously baptized and I got my communion, but I didn't get my confirmation, which is like the third step. And it
Oh,
was so
okay.
serious in my family that my dad earnestly told me that I was going to go to purgatory, and
Yeah.
like that. He's like, he told me like this was in my late teens. I mean, this was 15 or 20 years ago, but he was like, no, I'm genuinely concerned about your salvation. Like this. So this is it's not that my family like wears the cross on their sleeve. It's just that like it's part of our lives. Where I'm Italian and Irish, and so that's obviously a fundamental Catholicism is like a fundamental part of most Irish and pretty much all Italian people and
Right.
their lives. But I don't think my own so-called atheism was ever really accurate, and I also don't think that agnosticism is really an accurate nomenclature for it either, because that requires some sort of uncertainty. I feel like more these days I'm certain that there's a lot we don't understand.
Hmm.
And I think I still line up more with the deistic founding father like idea, the Enlightenment idea that God, if God exists, he or she or it is a passive force that probably has no idea we even exist and doesn't care. But,
Hmm.
and I can wrap my mind around that. When you read about the Big Bang and you look at all the evidence, background radiation and the redshift and all that kind of stuff, and you realize everything came from one point in the universe, and we have to write mathematical models and simulations to make that happen, right? That's what's so fascinating about all these things. And I'm getting to my point, I promise. But
Okay.
uh, we write these mathematical models we see the way the world looks now and we reverse it to see like how it looked then. And I look at stuff like that and I look at it through a scientific and mathematical lens and I find it fascinating, but I also look at it through a philosophical and religious lens. And I'm like, but what if there were conditions at that time that we don't understand? What if that was the beginning in a different way? And so I'm open to my mind is open to spirituality, which I think is
Hmm.
different than organized religion. And I must say, and I know this is probably, I know Protestants, which I assume you're a Protestant, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a little bit of beef between Catholics and Protestants going obviously back many
Right.
hundreds of years. But the one thing I will say is I've been more in touch with my Catholic roots than I've been in a long
Okay.
time. And by that, I mean, and I've been talking a lot about this with my girlfriend, is that I'm proud to be culturally Catholic. It's important to
Hmm.
me. It's actually more important to me than necessarily being from Italy or Ireland, the weird American thing we do
Oh,
where it's like, where's your family from?
right. Yeah.
Because that's what binds us all together, irrespective of, our geographic location. And I look back and I'm like, wow, Catholicism is a tether to the Roman Empire, and it's responsible for a lot of bad stuff, obviously, but it's responsible for a lot of great stuff too. And just from the arts and music and patronage and all of those things, I'm like, wow, the history of Catholicism is responsible for so much worldly beauty, so much worldly art, literature, interpretation. You think about um, Thomas Aquinas or something like that. Like
Hmm.
just the essence of the philosophy that oozes out of Catholic interpretation and reading of things and interaction with the world and stuff. And so I don't know if what I'm saying makes any sense, but that's where the connective tissue has been building for me. Is like, wow, like I was telling Micah that, and you probably know this, that Catholic mass was in Latin until like 50 years ago.
Oh,
And,
I actually
and
didn't know that.
like when my parents went to mass, it was in Latin,
Huh.
and you could still go to Latin mass. And part of me wants to, because I'm like, this is the way they used to do it. And I'm a traditionalist. So there's something very attractive about saying like, well, it's cool that you have the various, you had the Lollards of course first, but then you had, Luther and Calvin and all these guys come out, and that's great. And they spun off their own way. And I think a lot of that is righteous. The ridiculous, the ostentatiousness of Rome, and I mean, and indulgences and all those kinds of things. I totally
Hmm.
understand that, but no one looks at Lutheran art. You know, there's no Sistine Chapel in Calvinism. There's no capital city of Jehovah's Witnesses. Like, and I look
Hmm.
at that and I'm like, that's something to be proud of, and I'm a steward of that. Doesn't mean that I have to believe in the holiness of it, but there's something about the continuity of it that I find very attractive. Does any of that make sense to you? I've been going on
Yeah,
for a minute.
yeah, and a lot of this is kind of new to me because my dad, he grew up Catholic and in Catholic school, but that was something that when he after he moved out and became an adult, he didn't really kind of do much else with it because he just was he felt like he was forced into it, so he never really went back to it. So a lot of the stuff that you're talking about is new to me because I've never heard him really talk about any of that stuff there. Um, but no, that's good. Um, so man, there was something you said and I forgot to what it was. Um, that was it. So when you were talking about kind of I guess more of the beauty and the architecture and the things of that nature, you said something about like you didn't really believe in the holiness of it. I guess what
Yeah,
did that
like,
mean?
so holiness is a weird word. I don't believe in the divinity of it. Like, I believe Jesus existed.
Hmm.
Uh I think it's obvious. There's historical. If we believe a lot about Rome, a lot about the Middle East from that time, from the same historical records that talk about Jesus, then it all must be real. What
Right.
happens after he's killed by the Romans is anyone's guess. I have no idea, but I don't I don't necessarily believe in that level of divinity. I just don't know about that. What I know is that I believe in the worldly tradition of Catholicism that is a continuity from the Roman Empire, that is a tradition of art,
Okay.
language, whatever it might be, that I feel like at the very least I could be a steward of.
Right.
And I'm
Kind of like
trying to look at
the
it.
culture.
Right, exactly. And that's why I always say I am culturally Catholic. I've long used that term
Hmm.
because I like I've been listening to Alighieri's Miserere, which is or Allegri's Miserere, which is like an old Catholic song sung in the Sistine Chapel in the 1500s.
Okay.
And I'm like, this is, and I can send you a link to it, but I'm like, this is nuts. It's like Psalm 87 or something, but sung in like this really amazing. It's amazing, and I'm like, this is mesmerizing, and you can understand how sitting in a chapel surrounded by stained glass, a beautiful crucifixion carved out of wood by the finest artisan, painted walls and ceilings, beautiful architecture. The pews are a solid, hardy wood. That experience is fucking dope. And I think, to me, the only missing thing is like, I don't know that when I die that I'm going to go in Catholicism, go to the gates and see
Right.
Peter and see what happens. I don't know that that's going to happen. And by the way, according to Catholic dogma, I can't go to heaven.
Hmm.
So like, I can only go as far as purgatory.
Yeah.
Like literally, I'm not confirmed. So
Yeah.
even if I went to Peter and I was like, hey man, like I led a good life and I'm a right, and he's like, by the dogma, you can't be in here. So
Hmm.
I have to
Yeah.
go try again.
Has that ever, because I know for me, like when I was growing up, especially in Southern Baptist circles, the idea of not going to heaven like kind of terrified me, right? You would even watch, like, I would watch horror movies and see like depictions of demons and Satan. It's like I don't want that. That's terrifying, you know? Has that ever, I don't know, I don't mean this to be disrespectful when I ask this, but like has that ever like kind of pushed you to look at other, maybe not necessarily like Christian religion or just other religions as a whole?
Um, no, not really, because if the hominess and familiarity of something is not doing it for me, tied to all of this tradition that I am so into, then there's no way that anyone else is gonna get me. I mean, I'm familiar with
Okay.
the different. I've never gone to like a Baptist service or anything like that, but it's not like
Hmm.
that's not. I know that. I mean, I don't want to say I know, but I guess, but I don't think that that's going to capture me. This is well, it's Pascal's wager, isn't it? I mean, in a way, like where, but
You
it's
kind of like
it
you're screwed if you do or you're screwed if you don't,
yeah,
sort of
or
thing.
like yeah, the whole idea of saying like, well, why not just go to church and believe because you have so much to lose
Hmm.
and nothing to gain really other than worldly time that would be irrelevant to you in paradise or whatever. But to
Right.
me, I'm like, but God would know. If he's omniscient, then he would know that I'm doing it for that reason. That would be even worse. And so in my mind, not that I'm like fucking Thomas More or something, but in my mind, I'm like sitting here trying to read about things and think about them. And I'm like, if heaven exists, a
Hmm.
Christian form of heaven, whether it's Catholic or whatever it is, right?
Hmm.
I refuse to believe that the arbiters at the gates, whatever, however it works, would say like, you lived a good life. You didn't try to hurt anyone. You were decent. You made mistakes. You lied to people. You hurt people. I mean, everyone does that. But you
Hmm.
weren't an asshole. You weren't malicious or vindictive. You didn't ruin anyone or do anything like that. But you didn't get confirmed when you were 14. So
Hmm.
unfortunately, you're out of here. I
Yeah.
refuse to believe that a situation like that really exists. So if,
Yeah.
in other words, if there's an omniscience to your life, right? And I'm not saying like a predestined Calvinist interpretation. What I'm saying is like if God could access the files of your life and he looks through the filing cabinet and it's all in order, but he notices you didn't get confirmed and
Yeah.
he's like, you're out. No. So that just doesn't, I can't square that. That doesn't make any
Yeah.
sense. I just refuse to believe that the justice in me going to heaven required piety in some way in my human form of going to a pew and kneeling for 45 minutes every week. It
Hmm.
doesn't, does that make any sense to you? So
Yeah.
I just don't believe it. Like because that's the same religion that says like, I can be on death row and ask for forgiveness and go to heaven.
Hmm.
Come on, man.
Yeah.
That to me, that's where it all breaks down.
Yeah. And I think to a degree we would find some common ground there that, I mean, obviously from my perspective, it's going to be different from Catholic teaching, which I'll admit at this point, I'm not super familiar with. So I don't want to speak on things I don't know anything about. Um, but like, I know for me from, being aligned with Christian or, I guess people would say Southern Baptist, even though that's probably going to change here pretty soon because of recent events. But, um, yeah, it's not like that. For us, it's like you put your faith in Christ, um, and then that's it. Romans 10:9 says, if you confess with your mouth that Jesus, or no, what is it? If you confess with your mouth and believe in your heart that Jesus is Lord and that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. And that's literally it. From there, which I think you might have taken umbrage with on a few episodes because of that. Inmate on death row, they accept Christ, and then boom, they're saved. It's like, well, wait a minute. You know,
Yeah. I mean, it does. I
um,
mean, it just seems there is a massive, it's like what a black hole does to relativity. Like there's certain things in the Bible and in biblical teaching where I'm like, this doesn't make any sense. And a lot of it does come from a Catholic point of view. Like I still have
mhm.
no idea how Catholics don't look at themselves as polytheists, for instance. We worship Mary. I mean, we worship Mary just as much as we worship Jesus. I was
I
reading
always
a
wondered
letter.
that. Yeah.
I was reading a letter from the Pope a couple weeks ago that was to someone. It was about like migrants or something, and he signed it, and he was like, "May Mary bless and protect you." It didn't say anything about Jesus, and I'm like, "What the fuck is?" I mean, I have no problem with that, but I remember being a kid, and it's like we say Hail Mary, like we pray to Mary, we pray. And I was like, we are polytheists. I've been in people's homes where they have statues of Mary, you know?
Yeah.
And so there was just certain things where I'm like, I don't feel like I've been reading a lot about these different groups that would meet in the early Catholic Church, like and try to figure out the rules. And what I didn't realize is over the years there were like people that did believe this various stuff, and over time they were just bounced out. And that like that happened at Nicene, I think, which is where the Nicene Creed comes from, and all of that other stuff. And I just didn't. It makes me feel a little bit better because I'm like, oh, people are. I'm just ignorant and don't know that people already struggled with this stuff, and that learned Catholics know that this is like solved now. But for me, it's not. And
Mm-hmm.
so I'm comfortable saying like I believe in some sort of higher power. I believe in Catholicism as a culture, a binding culture. I believe Jesus existed. I believe. I mean, certainly the Old Testament, I don't know if we want to take it too literally, but certainly these are books, both in the Old and New Testament, that are valuable pieces of insight and wisdom, timeless wisdom, the golden rule, for instance, and all the rest, like that, these things that are timeless, like some of these things hail from the Bible. And we also can't ignore the fact that even Jesus is holy in Islam. So there's something there as well. So I hope that answers the question. I'm
Yeah.
open-minded to it. I'm always curious, and I read a lot, like insatiably. So
Mm-hmm.
these days, just the internet, because my mind's always bouncing around. And so I want to say that I'm probably more open than I've ever been in my adult life. And it's part of this philosophical, political, social evolution in my own mind where I'm becoming more populist. And that comes with more attention to poverty and class and the poor, which, by the way,
Sure.
was like Jesus's calling card. So of course these things are going to tie into each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely. Well, man, I'm keeping an eye on the time here. I know there's some more stuff that we could talk about, but I want to be mindful of your time. How much more time would you say that you got?
Yeah, let's just, let's go for another 10, 15, whatever you want to do.
Okay. Sounds good. Well, let me pivot here because I put it out to our patrons on Patreon, kind of like, hey, we're bringing Colin on. Are there any questions that you guys want to ask? And I think we can kind of start landing the plane with some of these, if you don't
Sure.
mind.
No problem.
Aaron L. White writes in, what are some of your non-PS favorite games of all time?
So most of my games are not PlayStation. My favorite games are not PlayStation games. If he means games that are not on PlayStation, that's easy to answer. If he means games not made by PlayStation, that's even easier to answer. But if we want to just keep it off of PlayStation consoles completely, Mega Man 3 is my favorite game of all time. It's an NES game. I'm a huge fan of the old Castlevania games and the Ninja Gaiden games. Let's see, not on PlayStation. A bunch of stuff on GameCube.
Mm-hmm.
Mario Sunshine obviously was a pivotal game for me. That summer after I graduated high school, etc. But mostly it would be things that would run on PlayStation. So you would have stuff like BioShock would be in there, and Castlevania Symphony of the Night, and so on and so forth. But the reality is that this question would be answered differently almost any day you asked it. And the more I play and the more time I'm in this world, the more I realize like this is, if someone was like, you really need to narrow down your 10 games of all time, it would take, if I wanted to do it deliberately and do it well, it would take a lot of time. I'd have to really sit
Yeah.
and think, because I would probably forget some random game and it would like blow up my list or something.
Sure. Yeah. What about Super Mario Sunshine? Because you brought that up a couple times. What is it about that game that kind of makes it one of the top for you?
I just thought it was charming. I mean, when you go back and look at, and I don't want to be a hater of Super Mario 64 because I think it's a great game, but when you go back and look at it, you can see everything that's wrong with it. It's a first gen N64 game. It's very loosely put together with, you can see the seams all over the place, the repetitive textures and stuff. It plays very well. It uses that bizarre controller very well, but Super Mario Sunshine felt like a more cohesive and thoughtful game. It's the same way I feel about Majora's Mask compared to Ocarina of Time, where both on N64, obviously, but Majora's Mask, even though it was made in a tight timeline, seemed to have understood 3D Zelda better than Ocarina of Time because they had to learn a lot when they were making that game. And I feel like the same kind of thing happened with Mario 64. So when you got to Mario Sunshine, I just felt like it was a much more satisfying game. I understand people had camera control problems and all the rest, but I really loved it. It's also been, I mean, it came out in 2002. It's probably been 15 or more years since I've even played it.
Yeah, fair enough. Well, that kind of brings into the next question for Alex Castellanos, because he wants to know between Colony Wars, Dark Cloud, and Wild Arms, which one would you like to see Sony remake, and how should they do it? Kind of talking about old retro games there.
Yeah, so Colony Wars is old Psygnosis game, and they don't exist anymore. Of course, they would go on to become Sony Liverpool. But Dark Cloud is a level 5 game. That's a second party game. And then Wild Arms is a second party game too from Mediavision. Wild Arms is actually like one of my favorite role-playing games. I love that game. And but I wouldn't, and I actually just platinumed Wild Arms 3 earlier this year, which took me like over 100 hours. It just was like horrifying. Dark Cloud is the game that I think I'd want them to revisit. I'd like a new Wild Arms game. I'd like to see what they did with that, but the original is so special to me. I don't know that I want them to mess with it. Colony Wars, I'm neither here nor there on. And I've been a little confused why they never revisited Colony Wars after PS1. But Dark Cloud, there were 2 of them on PS2, and I feel like it's a little bit ahead of its time. It's a roguelike dungeon crawler based on, getting further and further into like a cave and building out a town and getting resources and all of that. It would be cool to revisit that. And I like Level 5 a lot. The great studio. They obviously, I really love the Professor Layton games. I love Dino Cooney and all the rest. So it would be cool to see them return to that. But that is a Sony owned IP, so they wouldn't necessarily need Level 5 to do it. But out of those 3, I think Dark Cloud would be the one you would want to go back to.
Okay. Yeah, that's a series I've never, I have Dark Cloud 1 on PlayStation because they ported it over to PS4, I think, right, through the PS2 thing.
Yep, the first 2. And Rogue Galaxy, which was another PS2 game from Level 5. They brought all of those over.
Yeah, I have them. I'll get to them when I get through the backlog. Yeah. And then lastly, from Micah Hendrick, he says he's a huge fan of the crew that you've assembled with Chris, Dustin, Maddie, and Cognito. He's like, what do you believe are the strengths of these 4, and how do they bring those strengths to Last Stand Media?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm really pleased with this group we have too. And shout out also, like we said earlier, to Ben and to Micah and to Lockmore and everyone that helps us go. We really appreciate that. So Chris, I think, brings humor and he's funny. He's dark. So that really complements my humor a lot. And I think his comedic stylings and also his agnosticism in terms of consoles, and he'll just play where he wants to play, I think brings a lot of value to Sacred Symbols because it means, and I think I explained this on a recent show where I look at it as like, I'm the 100% PlayStation Pie and Dustin's kind of like the 50% PlayStation Pie and Chris is like the 25% PlayStation Pie. And each of those brings like a different flavor and a different amount of calories as it were. And so I really appreciate that about him. Dustin is industrious and hardworking. I recognized in him very early that he wanted it. Like he wanted the job. He wanted to prove himself. He wanted to leave it all on the field. And that's exactly what I needed. And that's exactly what I need out of my executive producer. I mean, he basically runs the company on a granular production level. And so he's very much appreciated. He's hardworking. He's honest. He's candid, which is awesome because that's helpful. But he knows how to communicate. He's a good wrangler. He knows games. He's good on a mic. So that's really great. Maddie is studious. Matt delves in, knows games very deeply, has a real passion for them. And the level of study, I think, and the deeper angle in which he likes to analyze games just always really synced up with me. And when we wanted to do Defining Duke, we knew not only that we wanted him to lead it, but that we wanted to empower him to pick his own people because I felt like he could bring something to the table that is very strong from a leadership position. So I really appreciate that about him. And then Cog, who's our newest guy, he has an enthusiasm that there's a contagiousness about doing his show, the Iron Lords podcast, which I've done once and others have done in our orbit. And I wanted some of that contagiousness in our formula over here. He loves games. He's always we have our good days and our bad days, right? But he's excited and enthusiastic. I always respect someone who both wears their heart on their sleeve and is able to kind of put their own stuff away, whatever it might be, because we understand that you on the other side of this are here for entertainment and our stuff is not important at that moment. I think that his enthusiasm, his happiness, his excitement, much needed and really welcome in our circle. So that's, I mean, I hope I handle that well, but that's kind of what comes to mind for me.
Yeah, and I would agree with Micah. I really like the team that you've assembled. It's a great just group of guys, just a great team. And even like I said, with Incognito coming in, I was like, I love his enthusiasm and his energy. It's hard to listen to Defining Duke and be in a bad mood because of just how enthusiastic he is. And so yeah, I would agree with Micah. You have a great crew over there, and you guys are doing some great work.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, if you want to kill yourself, listen to Sacred Symbols. If you want to be happy, listen to Defining Duke. If you want to have a good day.
That's a great endorsement for Sacred Symbols. Oh man. Well, Colin, I want to thank you, man, for coming on the show. Do you mind helping me thank our patrons who supported us this month?
Sure, I'll do it with you. Yeah.
Cool. I've got a list of them here in the document. If you want to read the names that are in blue, I'll take the ones in red.
Okay. So are we doing it like you go and then I go, or am I just reading the ones?
Yeah. I'll read the first set of names in red, and then you'll read the second set in blue, and then we'll go from there. So these folks who support us over on Patreon, I want to greatly thank them for their support for this month. That's Aaron L. White, Alex Castellanos, Andre Swan, Ashley Cronenbitter, Chris Freeman, Christopher Commander, Daryl Tavares,
David Henderson, David Matthews, Derek Smith, Isaac Stoltz,
Jake Walker, Jeff Jackson Jr., Jimmy Changa, Joanne Monroe,
Josh Broccolo, Kokorodaki. Yeah,
got it. Right.
Luke Strain, Mark Frum, Matt Edwards, Matthew White Chocolate McDougal,
Matt Millsap, Melvin Benson V, Micah Hendrick, Michael Toller, Mr. Butts,
Nate McKeever, Paige Pinson, Retro Rewind Podcast, Ryan 1701E, Sam White,
Savone Pena, Third Strongest Mole, Travis, Weatherman Keith, Wesley Ray, Xavier Medina. Y'all, thank you again for your continued support over on Patreon. It helps us get to continue what we do here on the show. Colin, before we let you go, man, some recos. This is kind of the part where we recommend some cool stuff to our listeners. Is there anything that you'd like for our listeners to check out apart from everything that Last Stand Media is currently producing?
Sure. You know, I was talking about politics and becoming more populist and a little more left wing. I still consider myself a conservative, and I think there's a lot to learn about the synthesis between the right and the left. And I've been doing that by listening to some interesting shows. And I've really fallen in love with the Jimmy Dore podcast, Dore, if you want to check it out. He's a comedian, but he's also he's very left wing, like a Bernie left wing person. And I like listening to people that I don't agree with, or that I figure out that I actually do agree with them on some issues and stuff. So I'm always looking for, not that I really agree with Fox News, for instance, but apart from Tucker, I have no interest in Fox News stuff at all. I'd rather listen to MSNBC just to see what they have to say. And that's how I got into Jimmy Dore. So I highly recommend it. It's very informative. And I'm really interested in finding these new connective tissue and tethers between the right and the left.
Right on. Well, cool beans. Dear listeners, the link to that will be in your show notes. As far as my recommendation is a game that I just finished called Death's Door. You can get it on Steam, Xbox. Someone actually, I think one of our patrons actually sent that to me on Steam. Awesome game. Loving it. Colin, I don't know if you've checked that out yet, but it's a really good game.
Yeah, Death's Door.
Mm-hmm. If you like Legend of Zelda, it plays a lot like that.
Oh, cool. It looks pretty good.
Link's Awakening.
Oh, there's a story. The first story was from Kotaku, which says Death's Door is as good as everyone says. Oh, cool. Yeah, I'll check it out.
Cool beans. Yeah, awesome.
Thank you for the recommendation.
Yeah. Well, Colin, like I said, thank you again for carving out some time here to join me on the show here. And like I said, like I tell a lot of our guests, you're always welcome back on the show, and let's kind of keep in touch, man. It was a lot of fun having you on.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. And I'm happy to come back in the future.
Right on. Sounds good. Dear listeners, real quick before I let you all go as well, if there's a few different ways you can support us, again, mentioned Patreon already. You can get yourself some sweet merch over on our merch store. Links to all that will be in our show notes. And as always, if you go to our website, thereformedgamers.com, you can follow us on Twitter, Facebook, Discord, Instagram, all the places. The links to all that stuff will be in your show notes. We'd love to connect with you so you can join the community, and let's play some games together. But until next time, dear listeners, be a dear, keep it locked here, and we'll see you in the next episode.